It's perhaps surprising that some of the most represented subjects in the history of Christian art are actually episodes or moments that are not explicitly narrated in any of the Gospels. The subject of the dead body of Christ was a subject that Michelangelo revisited throughout his career as something he's very famous for in his series of pietà or Lamentation. It's a subject that he felt particularly associated with. One of his earliest, most famous commissions being the Vatican pietà. But I'm thinking also of the final pietà he'd made, now known as the Rondanini pietà, that he intended for his own funerary monument. And that in carving your own tomb monument must be a very personal and emotional experience. And the idea that he wanted to be remembered and most closely associated with that particular iconography, I think, is a very powerful one. The Germans have a wonderful word for the pietà. It's called an Andachtsbild, which means it is a scene that occurs out of time. So it's not a particular narrative moment, it occurs out of time and for all time. Surprisingly, we have less images of the resurrection of Jesus than so many other images, for example, the crucifixion or the Last Supper. But I see in many of those images some suggestions or associations with the resurrection of Christ. So even if it's not being represented, it seems to be alluded to. One work where I see that operating rather wonderfully is in Michelangelo's unfinished altarpiece, a work he began when he was quite young in about 1500, and it represents the entombment of Christ, or perhaps more accurately, the carrying of his body to the tomb. And so it represents the dead body of Christ, but it does so in a particularly innovative and striking way. Historically, the carrying of the body, or the burial of the body, was represented with the body of Christ represented horizontally to the picture plane. And what Michelangelo does is he has the sacred figures holding the body upright for the viewer, presenting the dead body to the viewer. They don't really seem to strain under his weight. And in fact, even though they're supporting him, he seems to kind of float, kind of flame-like in the foreground. And the way I see that particularly convincingly is when you look very closely at his feet, which are portrayed side to side, and the little baby toe of one of them is just touching the ground. So he almost seems to be floating up. And there's something about that that implies that it's a dead body, but it's a body that is about to be resurrected. It's difficult to tell whether Michelangelo intended to paint the wounds of Christ. The way it was left unfinished, there are no wounds, and this is a perfected, immaculate body in the very Michelangelo sense, this very muscular, perfect body. And there's something about that perfection that implies a resurrected, fully intact body.